Hello and welcome to this week's Best of episode of AI and the Future of Work. I'm your host, Dan Turchin, CEO of Insight Finder, the AI-first system of intelligence for IT operations, and executive chairman of PeopleRain, the system of intelligence for IT and HR employee service. I'm proud to share that the podcast just crossed 100,000 downloads. So I'm taking this opportunity to thank you for listening. If you enjoy the show, please rate us wherever you get your podcasts to demonstrate your support for independent media and help more listeners discover our amazing guests. Today we're opening the vault and reintroducing you to Dave Kellogg, serial high-tech CEO, board member, and of course deadhead, discussing SaaS metrics earlier this year. Well, it's a week before the election, and we're all political scientists and data junkies. For the next 8 days, Dave is the original SaaS scientist. Listen as he puts on a masterclass about the metrics that matter, plus offers coaching for entrepreneurs about how to tell stories with data. If you don't know your CAC from your LTV or how to calculate the true sales cycle, listen up. Metrics matter, and not just to pitch your company, but also to run your business, to validate your hiring plan, to groom your product backlog, and even define your marketing strategy. The future of work may be AI, but even the best AI is not going to replace the kind of decision-making that only comes from really understanding how to navigate and analyze your customer's journey. With that said, I'll let Dave take it away. Enjoy. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're listening. This is Dan Turchin, CEO of PeopleRain and host of AI and the Future of Work. Thrilled to be here today with a fantastic guest. Before we jump in, a bit of perspective. It's 6 de Mayo, yesterday having been Cinco de Mayo. And it's roughly day 52 by my count of the shelter in place in Santa Clara County, California. The global death count continues to increase. There's no real way to comprehend the impact of the pandemic on human life, but we can comprehend the impact of the pandemic on work. And I'd say there's a growing sense of anticipation that a return to work is on the horizon. My beloved Beta Breakers was supposed to be May 17th in San Francisco, but it was postponed until September 20th. A bit of a cliche, but I think it's also an appropriate analogy. We're all runners. We're lined up at the starting chute. We're all a little anxious about the course and the weather and how the body's going to feel at mile 6 or 7. But we're all lining up, and we're eager for the starting gun to fire. Today we'll spend a bit of time discussing what to expect in the months and years ahead. We're lucky to have a Silicon Valley luminary with us to share his perspective. Dave Kellogg is a prolific blogger. Check him out at kellblog.com if you're not there already. He's a multiple-time venture-backed CEO. He's a SaaS metrician and an overall Renaissance man. Hey, Dave, welcome to AI and the Future of Work. Why don't you start by telling our listeners how you got into this racket?
Thanks. Thanks, Dan, and thanks for having me. I got into software originally as programming on paper tape in middle school in BASIC, but came out here, went to Berkeley, and basically paid for college by programming at Lawrence Berkeley Lab. And when I graduated, I started out as a tech support guy at Ingress, one of the original 4 database companies. And watching Ingress lose to Oracle got me interested in sales and marketing. So I moved over to marketing. I later ran marketing and business objects for 9 years as we grew from 30 million to $1 billion in revenue. And then after that, I ran 2 companies. I ran MarkLogic, an XML database company. I ran Host Analytics, a financial planning company. In between, I did a year at Salesforce as a GM for the customer service apps. And on the side, I do the blog, as you noted, and I've sat on a total of 5 different boards.
Like I said, you've seen it all. So eager to get your perspective. So here we sit in kind of the vortex in the middle of the pandemic. I'd like our listeners to get your perspective on what work is going to look like and kind of what work culture is going to look like in Silicon Valley on the other side of this.
Yeah, I think, to state the obvious, I think it's going to, in some ways, it's going to change a lot. And it's not going to change so much. I mean, I think in some ways we were blessed in Silicon Valley to already have a lot of work from home culture, either due to some organizations being highly distributed, or to, the simple reality of life and cost in Silicon Valley. So people have long commutes, so they work from home. High cost of rent, so people will work from home. So I think in general, we've had it a lot easier than many other folks in the transition to everybody working from home. So, and I think that's going to last for a while. I mean, I don't think we're all just going to start going back to the office, right? I think we'll see how it works out, but certain people may go in or odd days or even days. If you look at most Silicon Valley offices, particularly in the city, super high density, right? Desks more than cubes. Cubes were kind of, 2 decades ago, the popular thing. Now it's about desks, and desks do not lend themselves well to social distancing. So I think it's going to be an interesting return to work. I don't know exactly how we're going to approach it. But I think there will be a change. I think the bad news from my perspective is, I was a big believer in Scrum and agile methodologies, and having everybody in one room and on a whiteboard, and with Post-it notes. And I know you can do that virtually. I've done it at Host Analytics. We ran Scrum with a remote India-based development org, so you can do it remotely. But for example, when I was at Salesforce, when we designed our facilities, our offices were designed with specific Scrum rooms, and I think it works better when everyone's together. And I think, unfortunately, that it's going to be a while before that happens.
You've seen many waves of innovation come and go, and we in Silicon Valley do a lot of, call it navel gazing. We think that we've got a monopoly on innovation. Do you think that this period is going to change the kind of Silicon Valley as being an epicenter or the epicenter of innovation?
Yeah, there's a lot to that question. I didn't really appreciate Silicon Valley until I left it. So between 1995 and 2000, I lived in Paris because Business Objects was actually a French company. A lot of people don't know that, but it was born and founded in France. And my wife is French. And in 1995, a recruiter called me and said, "Hey, are you interested in relocating to Paris to go run marketing at basically a BI tools company?" And I flew over and did the interviews and loved the people and loved the space. So I moved over to Paris in 1995, quite some time ago. But that was the first time I actually appreciated Silicon Valley, when I was outside it, because everything was hard, right? You want a PR firm who knows Silicon Valley PR, can't find one. You want a design firm that can design tech, corporate identity, can't find one. You want someone who's got 5 years experience in product marketing at a software company, can't find one. You want a lawyer who knows about software contracts, can't find one, right? So all of a sudden, all this stuff that you take for granted when you live at the center of an industry hub, none of it's there. So it made it very hard to do things. I mean, and ultimately, in the case of Business Objects, we moved the company back to the U.S. As we got bigger. Somewhere around 1997, we started to move back, and by 2000, I was one of only 2 remaining executives on the East staff still in Paris. So to me, Business Objects was really 2 things. It was a venture-backed startup trying to win in BI. That part worked out really well. It was also an experiment to see if you could create Silicon Valley outside of France. And that part didn't. And the other thing I'd note about that experience, which was, this is really the killer, was everyone who was successful at that company left France, because France is a very high tax system, and they have a wealth tax. And literally anybody who was in early who did super well left. And Silicon Valley is the opposite of that. I think the biggest strength of Silicon Valley is after you go knock it out of the park at your company, you either become a venture capitalist and invest and sit on a dozen boards, or you become a consultant like me and sit on a bunch of boards and advise founders. And it's kind of the re-injection of talent into the system. Investors, advisors, board members, that's what makes it so special here. And I think that's very hard to replicate. So I don't think we have a monopoly on innovation per se, but on this model of kind of re-injecting experienced talent fueled by the 2 universities here, Cal and Stanford, boy, that's hard to beat.
Well said. It's a unique perspective based on what you said, Business Objects in France. So there's a lot of hand wringing right now in Silicon Valley, both on the venture capital side as well as on the startup side. We're kind of rethinking who needs venture capital, who's a good candidate, and how should, on the startup side, how should fundraising strategies change? What's your thought process? What's your coaching to startups raising cash?
Yeah, this one's tricky because look, if you can avoid venture capital, it's probably better if you can avoid it. But and the question is then what circumstances? Because obviously you get diluted very heavily by VC. You can lose control of your company. You can be head faked into making bad decisions. There's a lot of bad things that can happen with VC. And look, there's a lot of very, very, very good things that can happen as well. I would note, for whatever it's worth, that most of the companies I've worked at were not kind of VC-fueled rocket ships. We took VC, but Business Objects was formed on a total of $4 million in VC, for example. Not very much money. Host Analytics, which I ran, raised a total of 85, which I thought was a lot of money at the time. But now your mean public company is raising 300. So I think, first, things have changed, right? Back in the day, you'd maybe raise 20 or 30 million. You'd go public raising 100 million, and you'd go public maybe at 30 million in revenue. Business Objects went public in 1994 at 30 million in revenue. So things have changed a bunch. And VC, to me, the most important thing in VC is that you be aligned with your investors. And for example, I ran MarkLogic. MarkLogic was a Sequoia company, and Sequoia wants big exits. And at some point in the history of that company, I thought we should sell it for a relatively kind of modest base hit or double. And there was very little appetite for that around the table. And that's what I would call an alignment issue. So I do think as a founder, hey, if you want to swing for the fences, if you've got a big market that's just forming and there's a huge TAM and you can build a company worth billions of dollars, go raise VC, raise a ton of it, and run as fast as you can to grab share, right? That's where I think VC really works best, in kind of new and emerging markets where you have a chance to, and you need to go fast, because if you don't go fast, there's 5 other startups who are going to go faster than you and you'll lose. In some ways, I think good categories have become fun contests. So if you're going to be in a good category and create a mainstream thing, raise VC. If you're not, then maybe you don't. If you want to do like a niche business on the side, like a friend of mine founded Perforce, if you know them, it was a configuration management tool, and he bootstrapped it. And he owned a phenomenal percentage of that company when he sold it in the end. So the cost of VC is dilution. I think, just to remember one statistic, at Box, I think Aaron Levy owned less than 5% at the IPO, right? Because he raised a lot of capital. He was presumably a young guy without a track record, so he got a little more heavily diluted. So, you can get pretty diluted if you go raise a ton of money, particularly if it's your first company. I think VC is a great thing. I think VCs provide a lot of valuable advice to companies, particularly if you work with good ones. But I think the fundamental question, and it's impossible to put this genie back in the bottle, is before you go raise it, make sure you and your VCs want to do the same thing, and make sure you understand what you signed up for. Because if you're raising money from a top firm, they're going to want a huge exit, and they're going to want to go for it. And if you were hoping to sell the company, owning half of it and sell it for $30 million, that's not going to happen. Or sell it for $50 million. That's simply not going to happen.
Great advice. Yeah, all about alignment. So in Silicon Valley, you and I both are data obsessed, and a lot of our colleagues are. What's the one metric that every SaaS CEO should be tracking?
Okay, well, it's a good one. Let's think. Get it down to one. I'm going to have to get warmed up. I think, well, first, obviously, ARR, but that's kind of basic. The value of your company is determined by your ARR and its ARR growth rate, right? To me, if I know those two metrics, I can, just with those two metrics, give you a pretty good estimate on how much your company is worth. So that's kind of the finance perspective. I think operationally, if you could only get one metric, it would be LTV to CAC. So lifetime value divided by customer acquisition cost. And that's kind of a compound metric. There's a lot packed in there, but you only gave me one. So let me just walk through it real quick. So the numerator is lifetime value, which is effectively 1 over your churn rate, right? So you're saying, hey, if you've got a churn rate of 10%, then your average customer lifetime is going to be 10 years. So if it's 100 ARR customer, 100 unit ARR customer times 10 years, that's going to be 1,000 units of ARR. So that would be your lifetime value of the customer. And then the customer acquisition cost is what you spend to acquire a dollar of ARR. So just pretend that 100 unit customer, $200 to acquire. So you have a CAC of 2, which is on the high side. In this particular scenario, you would end up with an LTV to CAC of 5, right? So you'd have 1,000 units on top and divided by 200 at the bottom. So you have an LTV to CAC to 5, which is actually a pretty good one. By the way, the minimum on that metric is 3. 5 is considered good, and obviously the higher the better. And look, calculations aside, the reason I like LTV to CAC is because it's one of the few metrics that actually packs in, this notion of what you pay for something should be a function of what it's worth. So if you have a really long lifetime value, great expansion rate, you should be willing to spend more to acquire a customer than somebody who's got a really short lifetime value, right? Because you're not getting as much bang for your buck. So that's the thing I love about that metric.
Hope there are a lot of startup CEOs out there listening who are taking copious notes. Good advice. So you've coached a lot of CEOs, entrepreneurs. You've sat on a lot of boards. What's the one thing that every CEO of a SaaS company gets wrong?
Metrics. I'm going to do this one metrics wise, right? Oh God, what's a good misunderstood metric? I mean, first, there's a couple of things people do wrong. This is more in general, but then we'll come back to the metric. First, they present metrics without context. So to me, if you're going to present a metric and you're going to say 17, I have no idea if 17 is good or bad, right? I might have an industry benchmark if it's a common metric. But to me, I think that all CEOs should try to present metrics in what I call trailing 9-quarter format, which is for the last 9 quarters, what was the value of that metric, right? So that way, and you need 9 quarters because software companies are seasonal, right? So I need to have year-over-year comparison for 2 years, and then I can actually look at the progression of this metric and get some sense for context. So that's the first thing, is presenting metrics without context. More generally, and context takes a couple of forms. One is history, right? That's one piece of context you can add. Another piece of context is, what was the plan? So you could do the math for me, right? And give me as a percent of plan. I don't want to be trying to divide 10 by 17 in my head in the middle of your board meeting, right? You could give me, what's the other piece of context? Your target. If you have a target for this metric, that it's not the plan, but your 3-year financial model says we're shooting to get sales and marketing expense to 40% of sales, that would be good context to have in another column. And the last piece of context would be industry benchmarks, right? Hey, what is the industry for companies in your size and your space? What is, the average figure for this metric? So to me, there's lots of different ways to provide context to metrics, but the generic problem people make with metrics is not providing enough context. In terms of misunderstood metrics, I don't know why. I don't really have one coming to mind. I mean, I guess churn is often misunderstood because people, they never know what to divide it by, right? I mean, calculating churn is easy. Here's my joke. Calculating churn is easy other than figuring out the numerator or the denominator, right? So for the numerator, what should they put in? Should it be, in my mind, it should be the ARR that churned. But some people like to use gross. Some people like to use net, right? And then in the denominator,
or even worse, customer count.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, you could put customer count, or you could just do. I was actually thinking, do you do the entire ARR base? Or you do the ARR up for renewal, right? And that's a sleight of hand people do. And look, I think they're both interesting metrics, because if you're doing multi-year deals, not all of your ARR is up for renewal. But boy, I'd sure like to know, of the percent that was up for renewal, how much did you get? So long story short, Dan, I think people play a lot of games with churn. So that's why I think it's misunderstood, or maybe it's more gamed than misunderstood, which is why I think it's increasingly kind of getting replaced by net dollar expansion rate, because that's much less gameable.
I needed you to provide this advice when I was a first-time CEO and I made all these mistakes. A bit late, but better late than never. Great perspective. So polish your crystal ball, Dave. What's one thing that we'll do in the workplace in, say, 3 to 5 years that will be commonplace, but today might just seem outrageous?
I'm not. So My belief is business travel is going to come back, but it's going to be very different. And I just think we're going to have a different view on business travel. And we'll see. I mean, maybe this is not a 3 to 5 year question, but a 1 to 2 year question. But I think over the next 1 to 2 years, and I'll go to 3 to 5 in a minute, business travels would be interesting. Like, for example, I'm working with a company to say, should we try to have an annual user conference in 2021? Or should we maybe make it a regional roadshow? Because while I think people are going to go back on planes by 2021, are they going to want to, sit next to somebody with a mask on for 6 hours to go to a user conference? Maybe not. Maybe they'll fly from New York to Florida for one, or New York, Chicago, right? But maybe that annual user conference needs to be a regional roadshow. So that's probably my latest thinking on kind of COVID-driven change. That as we reopen, I do believe business travel, until there's a vaccine, until the thing's completely gone, business travel will be the same. We'll do it, but I think there'll be a higher bar, and we'll be more open to shorter flights. I think beyond that, something that would seem outrageous today that'll be commonplace in 3 to 5 years, I don't know. I have trouble with that one. I don't think I have a good answer for you, Dan.
Next time when we have you back, you'll have thought about it and you give a different answer. That's good, though. Good perspective.
Maybe salary transparency. How about that? I'll make a bet. Salary transparency.
There you go. So I know that one of your passions is building cultures that endure. Tell our listeners what culture or what team that you've built are you most proud, and what would you say that kind of the attributes of that culture?
Sure. The marketing team at Business Objects would be the answer to that question. And I literally made a slide of the number of CMOs that came out of that marketing team. And it filled 4 columns of a PowerPoint slide. I want to say literally we manufactured not just CMOs, but CXOs, the vast majority of which were CMOs, 40. I mean, it's just an unbelievable number. There's like a 300-person team, and over the course of time, a huge percentage of them have gone on to great success, and not just at any companies, at great companies. I think that team, because really, look, the ultimate measure of success for you as a manager, in my opinion, if you want to know how good your team was, go 10 years later and see what they did. Because, look, you could have an average bunch of folks in a really hot market and great results. And that certainly happens all the time. And sometimes those people don't go on to do it again. Or in the case of that Business Objects marketing team, I had a huge number of people go on to become CMOs, and not just from the product marketing side, but from the demand gen side, from field marketing. It was truly from communications. It was really impressive. So, and I think what made that culture great was it was a bunch of very competitive people. I would call it a performance culture. Look, we had the benefit of having an arch rival, or several arch rivals. I think competition makes you better. So Cognos in particular was our arch rival, but MicroStrategy was a rival, and a strong one for a while. And it was just very much a culture of winning. We need to go out and win. We need to beat the competition. We need to win the market. And we need to have high standards. And so we had very high standards in that department. And I just think it's important because the culture itself. When I went on to run MarkLogic, I called this the antibodies speech. But when you create a culture of performance, because that was another great team, and they went on to some great things as well. Like, my number 2 guy at MarkLogic went on to run MongoDB, took a lot of people with him. That was an enormously successful company. And some of the MarkLogic people have also done amazing things. But in both cases, we had a culture of high performance and high talent. And the beautiful thing about those cultures is they become antibodies. If you bring in a weak person, the antibodies kind of surround them and kind of eat them. And that's a good thing, because it actually means the managers don't have to do all the work of identifying bad performers, that the team itself will say, hey, you're not pulling your weight in this boat. There's only 6 chairs. I mean, this is why I always thought MarkLogic was strong in this regard, because there was nothing easy about the XML database market. We had to be great. If we weren't great, you're dead. There were 16 companies in that market when I started, and 15 of them went out of business. And we built an $80 million business that's probably today $150 or $200 million business. So, and we did that effectively, in a vacuum. And to do that, you had to be great. Otherwise, we weren't going to survive. So I think the common kind of the ties the line between those two stories is just culture of performance, culture of excellence, and that makes people rise to the occasion, and it also makes people become intolerant of people who aren't pulling their weight, because that's what will kill a culture, right? Oh, you've got 10% guys who aren't doing anything. Why should I cut my 10% guys who aren't doing anything? And for a while, I did see that at Business Objects. We beat that out, but that can develop.
It's a phenomenal statistic. That should go on your epitaph, Dave. The number of CXOs that your team's created. Amazing.
No, I probably should blog the slide, because I made the slide for an Elation kickoff to let people know that that's really the way I think you should measure your career as a manager. And the slide even blew me away, because I'd never actually sat down and written it all down. And when I did, I was like, wow,
it's beautiful. If you have a metric like that you can share, then that is what you want to define your career. We're getting short on time here, but I got to get in a last question or two. For our listeners, what's your advice to a younger version of Dave Kellogg?
Yeah, people who know me will appreciate this. Jokingly, put your hands in the air and step away from the keyboard. That would be the advice. Email has never been. I'm not good over email. I don't think anybody is, to be honest. I'm worse than most. And I just think I would try to do too many things over email. And some people are naturally phone people. They want to pick up the phone and call. My natural instinct was to use email. And now today, people's natural instinct maybe to use Slack. But I do believe I caused my career more problems with bad emails. And I have some epic stories one day we could share over a beer. But it's just too many times I should have just either not sent something or picked up the phone or just mailed it to myself. And I think that will be the one thing that held me back, and it holds a lot of people back. And then, I think personally, email is a good communication mechanism for logistics. Like, see you at 2:00 for the podcast, right? But as soon as something gets complicated or difficult, I am not a big believer that the technology helps that much. And that I think we're actually better off on the phone or on a Zoom than we are, in comment wars or Slack wars or email wars or any other form of typing-based warring.
Well, Dave, that beer's going to taste great when we're finally allowed out of the house. So I'm going to take you up on that offer. One last before I can let you go, I got to ask. You and I are both big fans of live music. We've been deprived of a lot of shows over the past few months. What's the one live recording that you're taking with you into bunker mode in quarantine?
Oh gosh, that one's tricky. Because I'm a Grateful Dead fan, as I think you know, and they're doing some good stuff online. They have what they call One More Saturday Night. So every Saturday they stream a live show. So that's becoming a tradition. And then Bob Weir does stuff on Wednesday nights, which I usually don't listen to because I'm working. But on Saturday, I'll take the time in the backyard by the barbecue and I'll put on the Dead and Company live stream. And there's usually around 6,000 people on it too, which is, I don't know, kind of amazing for a live stream on every Saturday. So that's what I've been doing.
That may end up being the best advice of all that you've shared on today's episode. Dave, I've so enjoyed this conversation. I hope that some of these trends that you're prognosticating come to fruition. Maybe you'll come back on the show and we'll do version 2. How's that sound?
Yeah, it sounds awesome, Dan. I'd love to do it again. Great catching up with you again.
And thanks to all of our listeners. Another great discussion. Thanks to Dave Kellogg. We'll be back with another discussion next week.